and say thank you all for being here for this round of Lightning Talk 7 on day 3 of Amos. I'm here at the University of Sydney, which is on Gadigal land, and I want to acknowledge that the Gadigal people are the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and pay my respects to them. And so our first lightning talker is Beth Clarke. So I'll hand it over to you now, Beth.
Great, thanks, Jason. Can everyone see my screen? Awesome. All right, so I'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Clarke, and today I'll be presenting on my work looking at limitations that social and personality psychologists discuss in their papers. So I'll hazard a guess that the limitations section probably isn't your favorite to write up, but still, limitations are an important part of science for at least 2 reasons. Now, firstly, they offer information that helps us appropriately calibrate our confidence in findings. And secondly, they often serve as a basis for future directions. In this sense, the process of communicating limitations isn't just an exercise in intellectual humility, but it's also important in improving our science. Now, I think the importance of good science communication has proven especially stark in the context of psychology's replication crisis. Because this crisis has shed light on several problematic research practices, we hope that research limitations will be at the forefront now more than ever. But rather than hoping that this is the case, we thought we would empirically test that idea. So I'll start by defining the 4 validities framework that we use to structure our analysis of limitations. Broadly, validity relates to the approximate truth of an inference, and by that I mean a study isn't valid or invalid per se. Rather, some of the conclusions that we draw from studies might be more valid than other conclusions. So Cook and Campbell specify 4 types of validity. First, we have construct validity, which refers to inferences drawn from a particular measure or manipulation as representing the abstract entities they're intended to represent. Next is internal validity, which relates to inferences about the causal relationship between variables. We have statistical conclusion validity, which concerns the appropriate use of statistics in drawing valid statistical inferences. And lastly, external validity relates to generalizations drawn from the specific claim. Now, in considering limitations, we're particularly interested in how these validities might be threatened. Give you an example, if a study has a small sample size and therefore low statistical power, the validity of statistical conclusions drawn from that study might be threatened. Now, we were broadly interested in how limitations have changed over time, especially in light of the replication crisis. And in particular, we were interested in how the number of limitations and the types of limitations that authors are discussing have changed over time. So to answer those questions, over 8 rounds of piloting, we developed a code book to guide our limitations coding, and we pre-registered our design and analysis plan. We coded all of the articles published between 2010 and 2020 in the Journal of Social, Psychological and Personality Science, and that gave us a sample size of 221 articles. As for coding those articles, each paper was coded in 3 steps. First of all, one coder extracted limitations from the articles. Next, 2 coders categorized each limitation extracted using the Shiny app displayed in the bottom left there. And our 2 coders reached above 90% agreement for most categories. And in the last step, the 2 coders categorized each limitation, all 3 coders met to resolve disagreements and compiled a master sheet of limitations and their categories. And then we repeated that process 5 times. So in the end, we extracted and categorized 573 total limitations from 221 articles. And we found that concerns about external validity were the most common and statistical conclusion validity were the least common. So perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, social psychologists' biggest concerns were that the context of their study might have impacted their results. And our findings also mean that despite all the attention statistical related issues have received throughout the replication crisis, the attention wasn't reflected in authors' published limitations. Now, in terms of change over time, we found that more limitations were published over time. And that's interesting because we didn't find a significant increase in the word count of limitation sections over time. In fact, our results almost trend in the opposite direction. And what that means is that more limitations were discussed in the same amount or fewer words. As for the 4 validities themselves, we didn't find any strong evidence of linear change over time here. And there are a few possible explanations for this, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into them right now. Now, I couldn't possibly give you a presentation on limitations without discussing our own limitations. So our main limitation was our sample, in that we only sampled from one journal and only articles that included a limitation subheading. So that sort of means that our findings might not be as generalizable to discussion sections, but we're currently looking into that. And as for future directions, there's a ton of potential here. For one, future studies could investigate the relationship between limitations that authors publish in their articles with other ways of measuring limitations, such as methodological design choices, self-reported or peer-reported limitations, criticism in the media, and so on. Also, future studies might want to investigate the relationship between published limitations and other features of articles, such as like the extent to which authors calibrate their conclusions, and so on. So I'll wrap up, leave you with this quote, that science is not finished until it's communicated. And I'd also like to thank my co-authors, Sarah Schivoni and Samin Vizier, for all their help on this project. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much, Beth. Great talk. Really interesting stuff. And thank you for being punctual. For me, there are 5 validities, but no big deal. So we have our next speaker is Peter.
Cheers, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that coming through?
Yep.
Yep, fantastic. Great, thank you very much. So in this project, we were looking at whether there was any particular relationship between 2 specific types of statistical reporting errors in psychology research. So just to set the scene a little bit, we were following on from some previous work by, excuse the pronunciation, but Newton et al. In 2016, which indicated that 50% of papers with a null hypothesis significance test result reported a p-value that was inconsistent with the test statistic and degrees of freedom, and work from Brown and Heathers in 2017 that indicated that 50% of papers with Likert type data had a mean that was inconsistent with the sample size. So there were 2 primary objectives. The first was to validate the findings of Brown and Heathers, sampling from a broader journal set, and also to explore any association between inconsistent means and inconsistent p-values. So the methodology, StatCheck is a package deployed in R, which automates the process of scanning articles for p-values and then recalculating them based on the reported test statistic and degrees of freedom, and seeing whether they are consistent or not. And the GRIM test, launched by Brown and Heathers, when means and reported means and sample sizes, when they adhere to certain criteria, there's only a certain number of possible means for a given sample size. And so it tests whether the reported mean is one of the possible means for that sample size. And if it's not, then it's logged as inconsistent. So the findings, Brown and Heathers in their sample set, which was drawn from 3 high impact factor journals in social and personality psychology, they found that 50% contained at least 1 inconsistent mean. I randomly sampled from a set of 103 journals and from many different fields in psychology. And I found of the testable articles with testable data that 60% had at least 1 inconsistent mean. So overall, I was able to find about 1,600 testable means, and 18.5% of them were inconsistent. So what we then did was to create an error proportion, because different articles will have different testable item counts. So we created a proportion, inconsistency proportion, and then looked at the correlation between that. So here you can see the article set from Brown and Heathers, as well as the article set from the previous year's honours student, and looking at the correlations between these 2 types of inconsistency proportions. Although it looks like there's maybe sort of a slight negative association in the Brown and Heathers set, all of the confidence intervals crossed 0. You can notice the 0 inflated nature of the data. So the correlations that we looked at were a standard Pearson's correlation, but also Spearman's Rho and Kendall's Tau, to try and account for that 0 inflation a little bit. But as you can see here, most of the associations are really quite weak. And in any case, all of the confidence intervals do cross 0. So what is going on? my supervisor and I went into this thinking that likely there might be sort of like some kind of positive relationship, thinking that if due to time constraints, transcription errors were occurring or typos were occurring, maybe some carelessness, that where one type of error was likely to occur, another type of error might also be likely to occur. But in correspondence with Brown of Brown and Heathers, he suggested to me, well, if it's questionable research practices that are the cause, then maybe the data is sort of just being, you know, massaged just in one area, and you might expect to see a negative relationship. So what we actually found was a negligible relationship. So maybe my supervisor, I, and Nick Brown are all correct, and the effects are kind of cancelling each other out a little bit, or maybe there really is no particular relationship between these two types of statistical reporting errors. But what it indicated to me was the importance, and particularly considering some of the limitations of these tests, the importance of identifying the underlying causes of the statistical reporting errors to help elucidate and illuminate in further research what the possible relationships are that exist between these different error types. There was nothing really to go on. Neither my supervisor or I were aware of any previous work which examined the relationship between two error types. So I would welcome all questions, speculations, suggestions for future directions. And if anybody wants to get in touch, please do. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Great talk. Yeah, really sort of puzzling, ripe for some future research. And
yes, I hope so.
Turn it over to our final speaker. And again, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, or have about 10 minutes, I think, for that after. It's sorry if it's Iza or Iza, not sure.
Hi, yeah, it's Iza.
Iza. Sorry. Oh,
Thanks for having me. No worries. Common mistake. That's all right.
Thank you.
Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yep.
Yep, all good? Yep. Okay, so hi everyone. So today I'll be touching on methodological integrity and epistemic equity, which is essentially just fancy talk for letting people speak for themselves so we can achieve equality and accuracy in academic practice. So the research paradigm, depending on who you ask, looks something like this, but today's focus is just on the middle two elements. So we all know that the basis for any research and ultimately for any knowledge is in how we see the world. Epistemology, which building upon questions of what we can know, considers how we can know it. In essence, the limits of human knowledge. Methodology goes a step further by considering how we can find out what is out there to know. So our epistemologies and methodologies are shaped by our lives and experiences so far, what we've learned, who from and where. And it's easy to assume that our most fundamental and subconscious ideologies are universal. But our outlooks are all pretty unique, so we can't always fully understand one another. So Fricker defines epistemic injustice as an instance in which someone is wronged in their capacity as a knower. So epistemic justice simply involves giving a voice to those who would know, to validate their processes of knowledge production and data about themselves. Epistemic equity eliminates the inaccuracies which come with inherent bias because it makes the knower and the known one. Several studies show that the lack of diversity in academia is extensive. For example, less than 1% of professors in UK universities are Black, stagnantly for the last 5 years. There's also a significant gender gap. Only 28% of professorships are held by women. Another example, Roberts and colleagues looked at 26,000 psychology journals published between 1974 and 2018. On average, 83% of editors-in-chief and 63% of primary authors were white, while only 42% of participants were white. So note here that the subjectivities of people of color majority are being evaluated and reported on by non-POC. And this is important because the process of publication, the people by which it's made up, is reflective of broader social structures. And as a side of knowledge production, which informs a whole range of policy and institutional decisions, the demographic logistics of academia have the power to not only perpetuate existing inequalities, but to create new ones all the same. So here are some more specific impacts of epistemic injustice. It rationalizes marginalization. Many minority communities get left behind because their comparatively lesser progress gets attributed to non-existent biological factors instead of legitimate structural issues. So this is known as scientific racism. Also, misguided funding practices. Study after study shows that researchers and policymakers consistently prioritize the wrong issues. For example, the Australian government's Closing the Gap target sought to improve things like school attendance and life expectancy among Indigenous communities. But the Redfern Statement, co-signed by various Indigenous organizations themselves, aimed for improvements on more complex and nuanced issues like access to disability services and disproportionate incarceration rates. So this distinction signals a colossal waste of resources, which, by ignoring issues that actually require addressing, perpetuate inequalities. The bell hook speaks on issues of research positionality. No need to hear your voice when I can talk about you better than you can speak about yourself. Only tell me about your pain. I want to know your story. And then I will tell it back to you in a new way, tell it back to you in such a way that it has become mine, my own. You are now at the center of my talk. So, how do we fix all this? Well, we need to give academic power to communities so they can identify and solve their own social problems in the ways that they see fit. We need to give communities the rights to collect, own, and apply data about their histories and livelihoods. We need to magnify the narratives of communities and maintain them in such a way which prevents them from becoming secondary. And we need to give the power of direction and accountability to communities which have a vested interest in their own livelihoods so they can create new standards or maintain the same ones. So after all this, what might epistemic equity look like? Well, distributive epistemic justice would be the fair distribution of epistemic goods like information and education. Testimonial justice will be when the speaker no longer receives a deficit of credibility owing to the operation of prejudice in the hearer's judgment. That is, that which is different from dominant discourse will no longer be considered inherently lacking or secondary. The ability to contest with appropriate forums to do so, and epistemic contributions from all. Ultimately, methodological integrity owing to the well-informed narratives and self-examination of individuals and communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Iza. Really interesting. Like I'm very, I'm interested in the role of communal and open science and all that. And I'm sure you are as well. Okay, well, we have about 12 minutes, which is wonderful. Sometimes there's no time. So I think I only saw one thing in the chat. It was from Alex. I don't know if you want to. Oh, you're raising your hand as well.
Thanks. I've got a question for Beth too, but yeah, Peter, the Grimm test. So I don't publish in fields that or read papers that use Likert scale, so I don't have a strong sense of what you would speculate might be the most likely, the most common reason for a discrepancy in the Grimm test. So how much of it, I mean, yeah, could you give a couple reasons, innocent and not so innocent, for why that would happen?
Yeah, sure. So I think it'd probably be would not be honest to speculate on what I think the major reason is, but what they could be is certainly transcription errors. So one thing that I noticed when I dug into the data a bit, like one thing that was interesting to me, the most of all of the Grimm tests that I was able to do, the most common sample size was 20, right? By far, that was more common than any other sample size by a long way. And means that are derived from sample sizes of 20, if they're derived from integers, they necessarily end in like 0, 5, 1, 5, 2, 0, right? So they're very easy to check just visually. You don't need to calculate, right? Because you can just see it on the page. And the inconsistency rate there for sample sizes of 20 wasn't particularly lower. I think it was like 16.7% or 17% or something like that, whereas overall it was 18.5. So it wasn't that much lower. So that to me would sort of suggest transcription errors because it's so easy to pick up visually, like maybe people are rushing or something. But some of the not so innocent possible explanations are that people are kind of just nudging the means in a particular direction for a desired result. And I think that's where it sort of gets into that questionable research practice area, like how are you calculating the means? I mean, another thing could be, it's not necessarily the mean that's wrong, because it could be the sample size, right? Like maybe there are exclusions from the data that they then didn't report or something like that. So yeah, there's a range of different possible reasons. And
I'm hoping it's not too many transcription errors in these days, in the sense of writing things. Like I'm hoping that it's all being done in Qualtrics or something. But yeah, they might copy paste. Yeah,
copy paste or something like that. Yeah, those sort of things. Yeah, so there was some, just sort of like some quirky things that certainly happened, analysing some of the papers, which really was puzzling for me as to, what's actually going on here. And I think without access to, the underlying data, it's, I don't know whether it's possible to tell. Yeah.
Can I ask Beth, or is someone ahead of me for the next question?
Sorry, go ahead.
Beth, that was really interesting. I'm not in a field, again, that has limitation sections in the paper. So I'm wondering to what extent a lot of it is sort of formulaic. So just sort of I wonder if you could get a qualitative feel from you, based on you unfortunately having to read hundreds of these things. How much of it is sort of formulaic, like I would imagine, because external validity is so easy to say about any paper that they're always going to throw something in there about that. And because there's still this filter, obviously, on getting into the journal, that you sort of don't want to admit like serious limitations potentially, whether that might, you said there could be multiple reasons why there isn't a change in trends over time. And I wonder for the different kinds of validities threats, and I wonder whether one reason might be, they're actually just looking for like the easy ones to mention that don't really threaten their core thesis. And so all these limitation sections don't do the job that we might hope they do.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think that was sort of part of our theorizing about statistical conclusion validity being the least prevalent reported limitation, because if you say, oh, the statistical analyses that we ran were flawed, then it's like, okay, we'll go back and run them properly, or like find a way to do them properly. And actually you do find a similar sort of structure has been applied in a few different fields, and across 3 out of the 4 total studies, statistical conclusion was the highest. It was the lowest reported validity in the limitation section. So I guess in that sense, there is, I hesitate to say formula, but in terms of the actual limitation sections themselves, there definitely was like firstly, secondly, thirdly, fourthly, and we're still getting into, potential exploratory analyses to dig into that a little bit more. But yeah, you're right. Like external validity being the most common one could just point to people are very happy to say, oh, this, result might not apply to this context. Like it could apply to any context. And it's like, it's really tough to, we sometimes struggle with like, do we give the authors credit for this as a limitation when it sort of doesn't quite seem like it's a limitation of their study? So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but yeah, like there are it's a really complicated sort of thing to work out what drives the limitations that authors are discussing in their papers, because one is, they want to get published, obviously. So I was talking with Adrian before about the papers that, might have the biggest limitations at the forefront might not get published in the end. And so there are all these competing factors. But yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I might, I asked a really kind of broad question. I tried to make it more concrete to Iza, but Amos, open science, and team science, citizen science, like, did those worsen the inequities you looked at, or they help in any way?
I reckon they help. I guess it depends on the organization. It depends on who they're run by and what kind of liberties they give to the people who are in them. Because for me, the perspective is more from the angle of intersections and ways of being. So it's matters of race, it's matters of gender, it's matters of sexual orientation, of class, in the sense that it's not really a matter of bad intentions. It's just a matter of not fully being able to understand someone else's lived experience if you're in a completely different realm of being, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. I'm just thinking more like true, like collaborative, integrative work should help, but maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. It's hard to say, I guess.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Peter, did you see Elliot's quick technical question? I don't know if you wanted to address it here in the chat. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Novice mistake. The sample from Brown and Heathers was just across 3 journals, and they were 3 APA journals that were all high impact factor. But the other set was from I think the total set was from extracted test statistics from psychology and psychiatry journals that are available on PubMed Central open access, and so they were all drawn from that set.
And you wouldn't have had a chance to look at this yet, but there's another question from before. Can we work out with reasonably high probability that the Grimm error is a typo, e.g. low sample size, and 3.67, but inconsistent with 3.76?
It's more of a comment than a question, I think.
Okay. Sorry, just trying to go through these online. Well, taking that as more of a comment than a question. Oh, right. Now this is...
Oh yeah, so I was Peter's supervisor, and so somebody asked before whether you could work out whether they were typos. Usually not, but sometimes you can be pretty sure that they're a typo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Got the whole team here.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it certainly seems from the number of possible means, particularly low sample sizes have a very low number of possible means. And so sometimes if you just switch the digits and then that turns out to be consistent, you sort of think, well, most likely that would be a typo. So sometimes you sort of get an indication, but most of the time it's, not really possible to tell with any sort of certainty.
I guess any error is a bad error to some extent. Anyway, so we have the next, unless there's any questions, please stop me if there is. We have the next event starting in about a minute in this room, so it'd be nice to have a bit of a time for some changeover. Thank you again so much to the 3 speakers, Iza, Beth, and Peter. Wonderful stuff, and hope to see you in the future.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.